I am truly honored to have the opportunity to introduce to you a dear friend and colleague. And as I thought about what I would say about Linda Thomas, something that maybe you may or may not know about her as a person, but also as a scholar and a professional person, several things came to my mind, images or dimensions of Linda. The first one is that she is truly the embodiment of womanist ideals. She is outrageous, audacious, bodacious, and courageous. She is a courageous Black woman who demonstrated to us yesterday in her profound lecture on the aesthetic dimensions of religion and South Africa that she is not afraid to stand in all of her glory and in all of her beauty and to speak truth to power, to give voice to the voiceless, and to engage fully in the struggle for justice and a just society. She is also a devoted wife and mother, and although she has many responsibilities as an esteemed scholar, professor, and minister, her priority is always making time for her beloved husband and daughter. Consequently, trips to Disney World, summer cruises, and even participating as a family in the Womanist gatherings during the annual meetings of the American Academy of Religion and the Society for Biblical Literature are all a part of her holistic experience of family. Indeed, I remember my first impression of Linda, who introduced many of us in the Womanist circle to her daughter before she even came forth from the womb. I remember my first impression of her as a woman who truly values not only her work, but also the gift of family. She is a sister friend. In the years that I've come to know Linda, I have found her to be a true friend who is always ready to offer a prayer or a listening ear in a moment of need. But perhaps one of the things that I enjoy the most about Linda is that whenever I am in her presence, I can always count on a deep down, gut-busting belly laugh that always culminates in a profound sense of sisterhood and friendship. She is also a woman of faith who is deeply devoted to God, who loves the folk, yes, even the church folk, who is committed not only to serving, but transforming the church. And finally, she is a respected colleague whose cutting-edge work challenges all of us in the academy and the church to strive for excellence in all that we endeavor to do, including our preaching and teaching and scholarship, so that we too can become agents of change, providing a word of healing and hope in a world that so desperately needs transformation. Dr. Linda E. Thomas is professor of theology and anthropology at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago, Illinois. Rooted in womanist perspectives, her research and teaching interests include anthropology, cultural studies, ethics, and theology. She is particularly focused on the experience of African American women and is passionate about uncovering and exploring historical and contemporary experiences and ideologies that govern actions, policies, and norms surrounding sex, race, and class. Her professional academic experience began as Dean of Students at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., where she also taught courses in spiritual formation. She has served on the faculty at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado, and Garrett Evangelical Seminary at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. At Garrett, she has also served as director of the Center of the Church and the Black Experience, and she has served as a visiting professor at the University of Chicago, at Vanderbilt, and Drew Universities. Dr. Thomas is widely published, and her first book, Under the Canopy, Ritual Process and Spiritual Resilience in South Africa, explores everyday life experiences of Black Africans trapped in systems of structural poverties, and also the ways that religion and culture fuel their resilience during the apartheid era. Her work was so significant that she received a Lilly Grant to replicate this research on the south side of Chicago. Her second book, Living Stones in the Household of God, is an edited volume that explores Black theology in the new millennium. And she has also published a wide range of articles and essays and chapters in academic journals and scholarly books. With a PhD in anthropology from the American University in Washington, D.C., and a Master of Divinity degree from Union Theological Seminary in New York City, Dr. Thomas's work has taken her across the globe to South Africa, Peru, Cuba, and Russia. She has been recognized as a faculty fellow through the Association of Theological Schools, as well as a scholar with the Pew Charitable Grant. In addition to her scholarly pursuits, Dr. Thomas is an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church. She has pastored congregations in White Plains and Brooklyn, New York. And she is married to Dr. Dwight Hopkins, who teaches at the University of Chicago Divinity School, and she lives in Chicago with her daughter, Dora. Please join me in welcoming for the second time our esteemed Taylor lecturer, Dr. Linda E. Thomas.
Good morning. It is indeed a pleasure to be back to deliver the second of three of the Taylor lectures. And I want to begin with a definition. One gentleman asked me, what is a womanist? And I thought it would be important just to explain that from the outset. And put simply, a womanist is to a feminist what the color purple is to the color lavender. That simply means this, that I look through the lens of Black culture toward liberation for women. So I hope that that provides some explanation, and that's why I'm so committed to lifting theological concerns about women, particularly women of color. I want to begin by saying that this lecture is a very special one, and indeed what Yolanda has said about my being outrageous and audacious will be demonstrated this morning. And in part that is due to my life being so completely impacted by my travel, particularly to Africa. In 2003, I was invited to participate in a conference that was being sponsored by the Circle of Concerned African Women. This group is convened by a giant in African theology whose name is Mercy Amba Odoyuye. She summoned women from across the continent, African women in particular, who do theology and who are pastors to Accra, West Africa. And I was invited simply to listen to the experiences of these women. The reason for the summons was because of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And so part of my commitment has been to lift up the stories of these women. But what impacted me just as significantly is that Letty Russell and Shannon Clarkson had also been invited. All of you know of the stunning work that Letty has done for years on the continent of Africa, particularly with the Circle of Concerned African Women. And so some of my fondest memories of that conference were because of the time that I had with both Letty and Shannon. And so this lecture is dedicated to the memory and life of Letty Russell. And so when a feminist in whose memory I stand and a womanist join together, we bring a message of profound importance. And so this lecture is entitled Theology and Anthropology from a Womanist Perspective. Structural Poverty and an HIV-Positive World, a Theology of Embodiment. We have come a long way in the United States, at least, from the many years when thousands were dying and President Ronald Reagan would not even say the words publicly. We have come a long way in the United States from shunning the disease carriers or assuming that HIV/AIDS is only a gay disease. The red ribbon is no longer an anomaly. Even a few churches here and there speak and teach about the reality of HIV/AIDS, at least on the single Sunday in December, that is World AIDS Day. Still, however, beyond that single Sunday, churches in the United States rarely enter into frank discussions about sex, sexual practices, or sexually transmitted diseases. We do not unearth on Sunday mornings the centuries and millennia of theological principles that govern sexual choices, gendered realities, or concepts of sexual power in relationships. Once in a while, mostly in private, when doors are closed and people are in crises, discussions may ensue about one of life's most fundamental components, sex. How often do we hear about or converse about the reality that women are the fastest growing population in the United States being infected with HIV, primarily through heterosexual intercourse? I venture to say rarely does it make it into our public or private discourse. How often do we talk together publicly about a sexual reality that will affect or is affecting approximately 50% of persons living in the United States? That is, one of every two of us living in the United States has or will have a sexually transmitted disease or sexually transmitted infection in our lifetime. That's one of every two of us. How often do we talk together in church or in structured public discourse about the inequitable power dynamics that receive support from religious teachings that tell heterosexual women that sexually our role is to please, accept, and submit to our male partner's sexual dominance? How often do we talk about the problematic underlying ideology and very real, unhealthy, and to be honest, less pleasurable consequences that result from it? If anyone is squirming, even just a little bit, at the notion that I stand here today and freely broach these topics, I rest my case. Here in the much enlightened United States, we still have a long way to go in dealing together with sexuality in an effectively public way. I bring up statistics and realities in the United States as a preface to my lecture topic, which will focus on issues surrounding HIV/AIDS in South Africa. I bring them up as a preface for two reasons. First, we are part of this story, this crisis, this epidemic. It affects us. It is born in part from our very own religious and cultural traditions in the United States. I have no doubt in my mind that HIV/AIDS is part of some of the lives of those among us today, particularly those among us who are African American, because of all the persons living in the United States with HIV/AIDS, a full 44% are indeed African American. African American and Latina women, by the way, who account for about 25% of the U.S. female population, account for a striking 79% of HIV/AIDS cases among women. Let us be certain that we in this room live with both the heritage and the physical reality of HIV/AIDS. Second, I am often struck by the ease with which these issues can be dissected, analyzed, and mused about, considered and pondered at from afar. Those in the Christian tradition have long looked to the other, the outsider, as the one in need of healing. We look at the other and see his or her or their problems that are in need of fixing. It is a tradition as old as the first attempts to Christianize the continent of Africa, and as ingrained as the continued attempts to place blame, send moral critique, or purport that the other need only learn about Jesus, as we have done, in order for their lives to be more fulfilled, more morally righteous, in short, more like us. I will not do that in this lecture. I must say first that I am part of the heritage and history that infiltrated and continues to penetrate the lives and ideologies that influence ways that HIV/AIDS is transmitted and managed. While I will explicate and share with you the realities of women in South Africa that live with the realities of HIV/AIDS, I do not do it to suggest that the problem is over there in some distant land or only affecting those people. It is my intention in this discussion, while focusing on South Africa, to be enlightening, yes, about the particularities of women living in South Africa. However, my ultimate aim is for us to listen and know that many of the same issues, in varying degrees or with situational differences, affect our very lives and those with whom we live, work, and encounter daily. South Africa forms a frame, and the women who live with HIV/AIDS are particular. They are not, however, the other. The issue is not only out there, over there, or with them only. I am a North American womanist, theologian, and scholar. That, at first glance, and I suppose to some degree, will cause me to be somewhat of an outsider among those South African women about whom I speak today. Please know, however, that when I speak, I do so as a long time. How long will reveal my age, so let me just say decades long. Researcher with deep personal and professional relationships among the particular community of St. John's Apostolic Faith Mission Church in South Africa, about which I talked yesterday. I speak today about a community that I have witnessed and stood with for many years as they live with, manage, survive, and thrive amid the gendered reality of HIV/AIDS in South Africa. I share their reality, aware that their challenges are faced in circumstantially different but ideologically similar ways by communities in my own neighborhood in Chicago, at my own church in Chicago, and among my students, colleagues, and friends. I begin with the basics, the things we know but bear repetition until they cease. Even those nation states, like the New South Africa, whose constitution speaks of a non-racist, non-sexist society, continue in practice to perpetuate patriarchal control of women. Just as women in the United States are far more often forced to live in poverty with the lowest wage-earning jobs, women in South Africa are trapped by the dual cuffs of patriarchy and poverty. Add to that the entrenched reality of racism, and we have the infamous and insidious triplet, the intersection of race, gender, and class that brings unduly difficult burdens for women to survive in South Africa. The penetration of HIV/AIDS has raced in to create a fourth point of capture that dominates the lives of women in South Africa. Here are the statistics. In 2006, the Health Department of South Africa reported that over 4 million persons are living with HIV. By comparison, that number in the United States, as reported by the Center of Disease Control in 2005, is less than 450,000. So that's 4 million in South Africa, 450,000 in the United States. Among those in South Africa, of those over the age of 2, girls and women in virtually every age group are definitively more likely than their male counterparts to live with HIV. Indeed, UNICEF reports that among adolescents, girls are 5 times more likely than boys to contract HIV. For example, of those South Africans ranging from 20 to 24 years of age, 6% of men live with HIV compared to 24% of women. That is 6% of men and 24% of women. Of those who are 25 to 29, the numbers are equally staggering. 12.1% of men and 33.3% of women live with HIV. Now, the sheer percentages of persons living with HIV/AIDS are enough to demand a closer look. But for this discussion, the divide among women and men is what brings me to this podium. I had to understand, unearth, and say out loud some of the reasons that women are disproportionately affected and infected with HIV/AIDS. I needed to know and to bring to light at least some of the reasons that 29.1% of pregnant women in South Africa are living with HIV. The reasons, big picture, are simple to name. We speak about them in classrooms and from pulpits with great regularity. Well, hopefully we do. While easy to name, harder to say, and incredibly complex to solve, the big picture sounds something like this: patriarchy, sexism, poverty, religion. Most major disciplines could point to a contributing factor. It is the confluence of a myriad of ologies that perpetuate practices that are killing girls and women disproportionately. UNICEF says it plainly, that the dramatic disproportion of females living with HIV is due to sex and gender inequalities. Women's vulnerability to HIV infection is particularly heightened by their economic dependence on men, lack of access to education, poverty, sexual exploitation, coercion, and rape, as well as by the engagement in informal and commercial sex work. Women face additional and more acute discrimination when they are identified as being HIV positive. Because they are often first to test positive through prenatal testing, they are branded as the spreaders of the virus. Once their HIV status is revealed or disclosed, women face being physically abused, losing access to important economic resources, and face the threat of being chased from their homes. And so the result of this, honestly and terribly, in this time of HIV/AIDS, African women and their children die first, without equal rights, without access to power, without power to influence, without access to education, and with religious beliefs that support and are complicit in male dominance. As South African scholar Mapan Okada writes, quote, South Africa's women's rights are inherently non-existent. The male-dominated South African society perpetuates to the current AIDS crisis, unquote. Research bears out the reality that a majority of African cultures judge women as inferior to men and consign them roles considered of less importance in the private realm of life. Males are the power brokers in the private and public sphere when it comes to decision making. This is very important to consider in the private sphere of sexual practices in an HIV/AIDS era. As South African theologian Beverly Haddad writes, quote, women experience great difficulty in negotiating sexual practices in their relationships. Because of their subordinate cultural status, it is accepted that women's role is to please men sexually, and they have little say over the kinds of sexual practices they engage in, unquote. In the second lecture, I am claiming that all theological reflection related to the HIV/AIDS pandemic on the continent of Africa needs to incorporate an analysis of the unequal power relations between women and men. Moreover, we must be mindful that the political economy on both macro and micro levels further marginalize women, particularly those women who are infected and affected by the HIV virus. Indeed, theologian Beverly Haddad again writes this, quote, poor and marginalized women are severely discriminated against in macro social and economic policies, resulting in this group continuing to bear the brunt of poverty in South Africa, unquote. As such, South African women are situated in a micro political economy that is adversely impacted by globalization. As New Testament scholar, Professor Musa Dube of Botswana asserts, quote, globalization as an antisocial force worsens poverty, escalates mobility, the trafficking of women and girls in sex works, thereby creating fertile grounds for the spread of HIV/AIDS, unquote. If a globalized economy is a primary macro force at work that allows HIV to breed, the places that insemination occurs is in the so-called private sphere of personal heterosexual sexual relationships. Across the variety of cultures on the continent of Africa, marriage and patriarchy are norms that together subordinate and create the conditions for the spread of HIV/AIDS. In sub-Saharan Africa, the culture of marriage is the primary vehicle through which African women contract HIV/AIDS. By culture of marriage, I mean the folkways and mores out of which African men and women live daily. In other words, marital sexual intercourse is the cradle in which the HIV/AIDS virus is rocked. The World Health Organization claims that the reason that there are more new infections among married African women than among any other group is because of, quote, sexual and economic subordination of women, unquote. Because practices such as lobola, which means bride price, contribute to women's cultural vulnerability to HIV/AIDS, conversations with women indicate that their husbands often treat them as if they are owned because the men paid lobola in order to marry. This treatment extends to the couple's sexual relationship, with the husband expecting sex on demand. Requesting the use of a condom often evokes anger and suspicion, and surely no need for male compliance because he is the head of the household, as St. Paul and Timothy, not to mention the authors of Genesis, remind us. The result is dire for women. It is, without mincing words or overstating the reality for women living in sub-Saharan Africa, the result is deadly. It is this simple. Condoms are the single most effective way to prevent the spread of HIV. Women have no power to insist on condom use during intercourse, and women contract HIV/AIDS at unacceptable rates because of it. Women do not discuss safer sex practices with their husbands or partners because it is not culturally or religiously appropriate for females to have such an exchange with males who are infecting them. Again, Professor Malpine Okaka notes that, quote, women are not able to discuss safe sex practices with their respective partner because women will be looked down upon as sexually promiscuous. In other words, to talk about sex is uncommon for African women, so to speak directly about a sexual practice infers litigiousness on the part of the woman. This, I remind us all, is not very different from this place that many of us called home, and certainly not different from those among us who were trained in traditional Christian social norms. Of course, religion is not at all the only source for norms that inhibit open discourse about sexuality, or the only source for the norms that rip away from women control over their bodies. Culturally, the misinformed belief that HIV-positive males believe that having sexual intercourse with a female virgin will heal them of the disease still persists. Layered onto that is the culturally rooted damned if I do, damned if I don't situation for unmarried women. It functions like this. Female virgins who consciously decide to refrain from sex are considered sexually unendorsed by men, untested, possibly incompetent at pleasing a male sexual partner. However, sexually experienced women can and are viewed as sexually promiscuous, an equally problematic stigma. Men expect women to have experience in pleasing men sexually and reject them if it seems that they are too experienced. Notice the entire perception of the situation is driven by the male sexual partner. The woman is in a vexing catch-22. It is not a difficult step for those of us trained in the Christian tradition to see how Christian teachings about sex and gender relationships and the glaring, gaping lack of open discussion in churches about healthy sexual activity makes the Christian influence one that ultimately perpetuates the spread of HIV/AIDS among women. Not surprisingly, it is the concerted governmental and non-governmental, largely secular awareness and education campaigns that are breaking the silence, according to theologian Beverly Haddad. She concludes with a familiar refrain that, quote, "The church continues to be slow to speak openly about the subject, which is so closely tied to issues of sexuality," unquote. Again, the metaphor of Martin Luther King Jr. resounds with grave clarity, that the religious community functions as a mere taillight behind other community agency rather than a headlight on this issue that is about life and death. Surely, the predominant literalistic biblical interpretations imposed on existing patriarchal African cultures reinforce the subordinated position of women and tie them down for further slaughtering by the HIV/AIDS virus. As long as this is the case, HIV/AIDS will not be controlled. It is unlikely that the church will intervene because African cultures are so firmly rooted in the church. Progressive theologians are trying, however, to bring a liberationist rereading of texts to combat the entrenched and dominant historical readings. Whether or not it is an effort that succeeds, time will tell. At least, and gratefully, there is an effort underfoot and across the ocean. New Testament scholar Musa Dube underscores the gendered face of HIV/AIDS and promotes a gendered, sensitive, multi-sectorial approach to the pandemic. She urges people to read HIV/AIDS into biblical texts in order to expose the social injustices upon African women. She claims that much biblical interpretation supports patriarchal customs in ways that, quote, "increase the likelihood that women will become HIV positive," unquote. She further argues that texts of terror that posit God's punishment upon people living with HIV/AIDS must be reevaluated in order for fresh and hope-filled readings to come forth for those living and dying with HIV/AIDS. Her edited book, Grant Me Justice, HIV/AIDS and Gendered Readings of the Bible, offers a method for communities to reread the Bible from liberation in the midst of the HIV/AIDS struggle in Africa. Given the matrices of oppression that cultivate the spread of HIV, this book's main concern is with providing a culturally sensitive tool that recognizes the layered nature of African male-female relations as they are tied to race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and class. Further, the authors write in a manner that suggests their belief that the Bible and faith offer liberatory models that can provide hope in difficult times. The book's goal is to advocate for justice and empower women living on the continent to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic by being resilient and persistently fighting injustice. It judiciously provides a rereading of key biblical texts, making it useful for a broad audience. Part 1 of Grant Me Justice focuses on the Hebrew Bible, HIV/AIDS, and gender, with Denise Ackerman and Johanna Stauberg rereading significant texts on women and sexuality. Ackerman rereads the story of the rape of Tamar as a story of violence against women in South Africa. According to Ackerman, the Tamar narrative offers the, quote, bleak immensity, unquote, of HIV/AIDS on the continent of Africa, and yet she claims that there are traces of resistance and hope in the passage, positing that the subordination of women is a virus more deadly than HIV. The story of Tamar, of course, has been reread by womanist and feminist theologians with some degree of success as stories of survival and strategies for brokering power in an inequitable patriarchal world, as have the other dozen or so stories that are sprinkled throughout the Christian canon. For those living within the Christian tradition, without question, these rereadings offer and provide a glimpse, and sometimes even a name to which women may look for inspiration, affinity, and strength. While I would not wish to take that inspiration away or diminish it in any way, with complete respect, I would posit this question and concern. Even with this liberatory reading, I wonder if it is possible or reasonable to place hope in scriptures to reshape patriarchy when the Bible overwhelmingly supports it. There is no question that the dominant, pervasive, and penetrating social standard throughout the biblical tradition is one of male-dominated patriarchy, where women primarily serve and are internally cursed as the one who first brought sin and death into the world. In this tradition, are women destined to be either temptresses or very minor characters at best? Does not the Christian tradition and its teaching, by their nature or at their core, fall into support of patriarchy? As an ordained woman in the Methodist tradition, I do not ask these questions lightly. But in light of the continued oppression of women throughout the so-called Christian nations, where the church virtually always functions as a taillight, and where South African women and children are dying in part because of my tradition, I must ask the question. As if that is not enough to ask, here's one more question and concern of equal importance. For the most part, even among womanist and black theologians, there exists a basic assumption that the Christian canon has universal application. With rereading, of course, but on the whole, the canon has been taken as an authoritative and foundational theological source that may be transported anywhere to anyone with equal validity and authority. And so I ask, really? Am I sure that a soul-named sacred text written in the ancient Near East in early antiquity speaks with any universal or God-given authority to the women living and dying from HIV/AIDS related causes in South Africa? Now, trust me, I know I am standing up here in front of Yale Divinity School graduates and faculty and asking the question of biblical authority. As I prepared for this moment and decided to ask the question, I concluded that there is no better environment in which to ask it. Thank you for your support. Okay, I lost my place. Among people who have studied and analyzed and written and published and preached and taught about religion and its sources, I thought this is exactly the right place to ask the question of whether the sacred text from one region written so long ago can legitimately be transplanted and set upon another continent of people millennia later and claim to still carry authoritative status. It gives me some measure of comfort to know that there are others who are asking the question and actively seeking to claim authority from other sources. While Dubé and the authors who are members of the Circle of Concerned African Women attempt to reform interpretations of the Bible, South African theologian Triniko Sam Meleleke and Hebrew Bible scholar Sinoni Tanar offer stories about women and violence from their personal lives to illustrate the ways that the unholy trinity, religion, culture, and gender socialization, perpetrate aggression against women. They claim frankly and unapologetically that the Bible is the primary source used by Christians to propagate violence against women as God's will through divine design. Biblical interpretation supports the belief that God bestowed upon men power and authority over women. This belief, held by both women and men, support the normativity of the subordination of and violence against women, which maintains a HIV/AIDS death trap for women. Given the statistics, the hardcore facts of violence toward women, which men from infecting women with HIV can be seen as an expression of this violence, it is difficult to rely on the limited stories of female strength in light of the thousands of pages that teach otherwise in biblical texts. And so the question is there. The question is here. Can the Christian Bible be seen as the authoritative and most life-giving text for women living with HIV? Is knowing Jesus and following his life of sacrifice, his relinquishment of power, and ultimately his glorified, unjust death, the most positive message that women forced to live into sexual relationships without power, where they contract the disease that kills them, the best resource for their survival? I don't know. I don't know if this is the best message, the message that will grant women any legitimate power over their situations, especially when even the Jesus story takes place in a patriarchal world governed by men. Whew. There, I've said it, I've asked it, I've given voice to the place where the sacred and secular clash into one another. This is the work I do as a theologian and anthropologist. In theory, sure, I'm all for the notion of a loving God who understands pain and injustice and promises redemption. I'm all for the comfort that that can and does bring sometimes. I am not for the notions of patriarchy, the messages of submission, and the model of women predominantly presented in the Christian scriptures. Not for my life, not for the lives of African American women, and especially not for the lives that become deaths among South African women infected, unjustly so because of forced submission, sacrifice, and patriarchy. So now what? We've explored the pockets of traditional theology that are trying to make sense of and find life in the Christian scriptures. What are the other methods of survival that can bring and do bring life to women affected by HIV/AIDS? First, lives can be changed through the eradication of poverty. If churches spend more on eradicating poverty and less on preaching, then we would be bringing a message and giving a message to women in South Africa, because the political economy of HIV/AIDS determines who lives and who dies of this disease. While HIV/AIDS does not discriminate between the rich and the poor, it is the poor who are most adversely affected by the disease, resulting in the largest number of deaths being among the poor. African scholar Eunice Kamara claims that HIV/AIDS has such a negative impact upon the poor that it plays plays a significant role in the advancement of poverty. This is what she writes, quote, "While HIV/AIDS is not confined to the poor, poverty contributes enormously to the spread of HIV and to the development from HIVs to AIDS. On the other hand, HIV/AIDS contributes enormously to poverty. This means that a vicious cycle exists where poverty contributes to HIV/AIDS and vice versa, complicating the situation," unquote. U.S. AIDS Associate Director of Policy, Strategy, and Research, Robert Heck, speaking at the World AIDS Conference held in Durban, South Africa in 2000, supports Kamara's thesis. He writes, quote, "Breaking this cycle will require not only increased investments in more effective HIV prevention and care, but also more effective measures to combat poverty," unquote. Of course, not unlike virtually all patriarchal nation states, poverty disproportionately affects women. From land rights that restrict land inheritance of women to access to education and health care, women bear the burden of living with poverty while living with HIV/AIDS. Land is transferred upon a husband's death not to his wife, but to a male relative who has no obligation to allow the woman and or her children to remain there. Even so, she has far less access to jobs that pay enough to maintain home, land, or on the same level she could with her husband. Further, illiteracy is at least 50% in rural areas. Hospitals and clinics are virtually non-existent in or ill-equipped in poor communities. Apart from religious ideology of any kind, these are tangible ways that religious communities can provide the services and education necessary to remove one of the barriers to women's health and life. As education and income increase, HIV/AIDS decreases. This we know. May we do something with that knowledge without spreading the word of patriarchy. These are the things that those among us with resources can do to save the lives of women forced to live with HIV/AIDS. One final thing we can do, approach we can take and model from which we can learn. We, as primarily Western-trained scholars, can be quiet. We can stop theorizing, planning, and imposing our solutions on the people of South Africa. Instead, we can simply be quiet, well, almost completely quiet. We may ask for an invitation to witness the ways South African communities are developing survival and healing strategies. If we are invited in, then we can be quiet. We can be blessed by watching, observing, and seeing the solution designed by those who know far more about living with HIV/AIDS in epidemic proportions. I did that. Rather than go to bless or impart or to teach, I go to South Africa to the St. John's community, and I am blessed. I learn how those who live daily in community rife with poverty, patriarchy, and poisoned by HIV/AIDS have developed ways to heal, to care, and to manage, and to get by in situations that most of us, myself included, would have no idea where to begin. When I am in the St. John's community, I am struck immediately and blessed surely by the ways that one community, surrounded by patriarchy, poverty, and disease, all of epidemic proportions and each as insidious as the other, has found ways to heal individuals, seek out those who may not otherwise find a clinic, and at the same time work to change the systemic systems within their own community and culture that contribute to the real life embodied consequences of HIV/AIDS. I come back to close to the questions that I asked earlier. Does or should or can the Christian Bible serve as the ultimate source of authority in the lives of South Africans living with the HIV/AIDS epidemic? Is it the Christian Bible that gives the St. John's priest healer the authority to take care among the people? Is the message of a sacrificing Jesus who promises some otherworldly existence the central message necessary for full and complete wholeness? Is the message of a sacrificing servant model a healthy one for subjugated women? The answer is, I don't know. But here and right now, I must begin by asking these questions. Perhaps as we learned from St. John's and ask first in our own communities, how does my theological and religious community contribute to the penetration of HIV/AIDS? Because as I mentioned at the outset of this lecture, South Africa is a frame with real people, real bodies that face epidemic challenges. However, the problem of HIV/AIDS, its links to poverty, its confluence with heterosexual norms that are supported by biblical teachings, live, breathe, and breed among us. May we continue the conversation until we are no longer a tail light, but the headlight that searches within and ultimately shines and exposes those things that we can start, and change here in our own selves, in our own homes, and in our own communities. Thank you very much.